our hosts, I would like to invite to the stage Graeme Jackson, Head of Partnership at Travel Foundation.
Thank you.
As our speakers, we will have Griet Geudens, Quality and Sustainability Consultant at Visit Flanders. And Dr. Mihee Kang, GSTC Director at Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Can you sit in the middle, please? Is that okay? Can you sit in the middle? Right, good afternoon, everyone. Well done for making it back after lunch. I'm sure you're all enjoying the wine and the coffee, so it's great that so many of you could be here. First, I'd just like to start with a couple of thanks. Thanks to lovely panellists for joining today. They're going to be giving you a bit of an insight into the work that they've been doing actually in destinations at the coalface. We're trying to move the sustainable tourism conversation on. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background, really, a bit of scene setting. Firstly, before I do that, I'd like to introduce my organisation, for those that don't know it. So the Travel Foundation has been involved in sustainable tourism since way before it was fashionable. We were set up in 2003, and we work in very close collaboration between quite a diverse range of tourism stakeholders, helping them to better understand the challenges and opportunities that tourism presents, and very much supporting them with implementation of more sustainable policies and practices in destinations. I've been with the organisation now for about 7 years, and my role is Head of Partnerships, so I'm the sort of interface between the private sector and other organisations and our work. So today we're here to talk about the invisible burden of tourism, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more to you today. So if I can just switch this over, let's see. I may need some help. Okay, so we all pretty well understand the economic benefits of tourism. There's been decades of research and alignment of data from people like UNWTO and WTTC. We all understand that tourism creates jobs, investment, tax revenue, it stimulates entrepreneurship, it can provide a path to development. But all industries have costs as well as benefits. And what do we really know about the costs of tourism? I suspect that no one here or anywhere will be able to give those costs at the same level of detail that we can all relay the benefits. There are costs particularly to host every additional visitor. And what we don't know by failing to measure those costs is whether tourism is actually paying off for a destination and its community, whether it's covering its costs. And can you imagine running a business in that way? Because that business wouldn't last very long if you were just looking at the turnover and not looking at the cost of doing business. One thing we do know is that destinations around the world are struggling to manage tourism growth. There's been concerns centred around things like over-tourism in cities like Amsterdam and Barcelona, and even in remote places such as this in Norway. Historical, natural and cultural monuments are linchpin attractions for destinations. They promote higher GDP for regions and nations. But their management costs are often independent of national tourism strategies, and in many cases they're cracking under the weight of heavy visitation. Now, I didn't want to pick out Norway as an example here of bad management, but this attraction, this visitor attraction you see and you saw on the previous slide, is an example of where here's an asset that's not actively being promoted by the DMO. They use no photos of this rock in their marketing materials at all. In fact, they're actively trying to remove images from photo libraries and so on of this attraction. There simply isn't the infrastructure to cope with the numbers of tourists that want to see this, and they're not really making any money in order to covering these costs either around people that are choosing to trek up to these sites. even costs in terms of people approaching, this is like a, 6-8 hour trek up to this site, people going in flip-flops, inappropriately prepared for the journey, having to be rescued by mountain rescue. These are all costs that add up on a destination that aren't covered because those assets don't belong to anyone. There's a right to roam in this country. You can go where you like, but what happens when one spot becomes a tourism asset? So this is why we, late last year, we commissioned some research with Cornell University and Eplerwood International to better understand not just what was happening, but what were the root causes and potential solutions that might address some of these issues, so that we can stop trying to put bandages on the problem, stop trying to have to do things like close destinations down. And what we found, in a nutshell, in the report, which is available on our website, and you can go to invisibleburden.org if you'd like to download a free copy of this report, was that there's a range of costs being incurred by destinations and their taxpayers without recompense and often without even knowing it. So without knowing these costs, planners cannot factor in the additional impacts and demand from tourism on their infrastructure investment decisions, and that's what we call the invisible burden of tourism. Each tourist is sharing very important facilities with local people. It's using lots of vital resources, and these are not included in the accounting of the cost per tourist. Increased demand without additional revenue from tourism leads to problems. You know, GDP metrics might show growing benefits, but meanwhile destination costs are rising with each new arrival, and we're not tracking that cost. And that leads to increasingly poor management of resources, of utilities, of infrastructure. So, what could this mean? Sure, tourism businesses pay rates and taxes for amenities, but there's still costs borne by residents. The cost of expanding infrastructure to service tourism demand, the higher costs of servicing peak seasonal demand, so for example, additional energy requirements a destination has during a small period of the year, means that they must look to invest in infrastructure to cope with that demand. So things like desalination of water, additional power generation facilities. You know, these are costly, not only for a destination to invest in, but also have a cost in terms of the carbon impact. There's an example in the report from Rhodes, and in 2013 they invested in $23 million in subsidising expensive oil-dependent power generation systems to cope with the additional numbers of visitors or temporary residents that they had in their destination. You know, that decision, while it sorted out the short-term demands, it locks them in for another 20 years of carbon-intensive fossil fuel power generation, which, you know, when you consider that islands are probably most at threat from climate change, these are not the sort of decisions that destinations should be forced into. We need to take a longer-term, better approach to planning, and we need the data in order to make those decisions. There's, of course, also costs relating to the environment. How do you manage natural resources and biodiversity when often they don't have a price tag attached to them? You know, we're seeing management of tourism, really the only option open to DMOs is actually to say, look, we've got to stop this. We've got to, you know, Maya Bay, which I'm sure, you know, we've all seen that example. Places in Iceland where they're having to stop tourists actually coming in to see these sites because they can't manage them, because they can't cover the costs of doing so. The investment simply isn't there because the costs aren't understood. Also costs relating to social and cultural degradation and conflict. And this is the area that's the most commonly associated with over-tourism. You know, we see a rise in the cost of living, we see a rise in house prices, we see ways of life threatened, we see locals leaving because they can't afford to live in historic centres. And these costs are being borne, again, by the municipality, so the residents, or they're not being covered by anyone. So the very assets the destinations are depending on are put at major risk. And without management or maintenance of these attractions, then destinations may actually start to lose value per tourist. So just to reiterate quickly, tourism requires more infrastructure than we're planning for. And this results in the invisible burden weighing down on local economies without the revenues to address the issues that need addressing. But the reason for this lack of accounting is not ignorance. Local managers of these vital resources and infrastructure, they've got very little data available to them. And their management resources is not necessarily coordinated with tourism marketing programs at a national or regional level. So without this coordination, they could be losing money and not even knowing it. And the burden on these destinations becomes very evident to all of the parties, locals and travellers. But we're just not connecting the two. So I paid in Lisbon, when I stayed in Lisbon earlier this week, and I paid my €2 city tax, and I was really happy to do so. But I was kind of asked, what's this being used on? And they couldn't tell me. It's the way it is. And I know, that Lisbon's making great strides in many ways, but it's experienced its own burdens. I'm reading the headlines. I've been there. I've seen the traffic. I've seen the overcrowding. I've seen the touristification of public space and infrastructure that's happening in that destination. And if you can join the dots and say, okay, we're actually going to use visitor taxes to tackle some of the issues and the burdens that visitors are putting on to a destination, that's a pretty compelling message for me as a tourist. I'm going to be much happier to make my contribution. And of course, it's not just good enough to collect data, because we need to know what to do with it. So we need really, as well as just having more data, we need people that know what to do with that data and can use that data to make decisions, to manage resources, to protect destinations from degradation. We need new science-based approaches to tourism planning and management. We need to create connections between different industries, different ministries, to have a coordinated conversation about how do we manage these things before it's too late and we see some of the problems happening like we do around the world in the headlines today. There's been quite a lot of work done on this in cities already, but we need to create more models for science-based interventions, for local participation, for regular monitoring. And I think this is somewhere where certainly the theme of this conference comes into play. Really great thing about certification is it's starting to try and aggregate and look at data in a better way. But we need to open that up. We need to get more people engaged with that. We need to get innovation from outside the sector as well to help us move our thinking on. I'm just going to give you a very short example that kind of illustrates this invisible burden, I think, in quite a stark way. Now, this is again, you can get this example from the report. But this is a project that was conducted with Harvard and using the International Sustainable Tourism Initiative framework, which is basically a diagnostic tool to help local authorities in destinations to measure tourism's resource use and the climate-related impacts of tourism against the various agreements. It's also been used to monitor progress towards more environmentally sound and sustainable solutions for SDG reporting. But what does that really mean? What it means is mapping tourism's use of resources and infrastructure to establish where the problems might arise. And you can see from this chart, and I heard some numbers earlier which were far more than this, but tourism is using per capita a lot more resources than a local. We know that, that's pretty clear. When you look at tourism as a percentage of the population, it's pretty small. When you actually start to look at its use of resources, its production of waste, it's it's some 3 to 4 times the local use, and obviously that can create some problems like unaccounted for costs. So here is an example that actually looks at the impact of private wells in hotels, and this is in Tozeur in Tunisia. And what you'll see from this chart, I'll just try and dissect this for you a little bit. Tourism is clearly somehow using a lot less water than it's putting through the wastewater treatment plants. How does this happen? Because how can they be, producing what have we got there? 25,000 cubic meters of water there in March, but only actually taking kind of 6,000 and paying for 6,000 litres. Well, pretty much all the hotels there have wells, so they're taking groundwater from the aquifer, which obviously puts its own costs on the destination, and yet all of this water is being treated. Now they're only paying for what they take rather than what they're processing. So, you know, once you have this information, you can start making more informed decisions. Maybe we don't need to be metering water going into hotels at all. Maybe what we should be doing is metering water going out of hotels in some way, and actually making sure that they're paying, that, you know, this sort of polluter pays principle in a sense, that you're paying for what you use. And this sort of data can be really useful to planners when looking at infrastructure and investment that's needed. There's often temporary measures put in place as well. His over a 3-year period, some satellite images of a temporary solid waste depository in Geudens that was developed because of these, you know, the large amount of waste that's running from tourism. These things can start as band-aids. We need somewhere to put all this junk, and actually for the time being, and actually then become pretty permanent features of the landscape. Again, because the costs aren't necessarily being covered to deal with this stuff. So, you know, this is all kind of trying to look a little bit into the future and the way we need to work, but we've got to kind of work as a sector with what we've got available to us now as well. We are committed as Travel Foundation to moving forward some of these things and trying to work with more destinations to better understand their invisible burden, to measure it and manage it. But we've got to have we can't be too far ahead of where destinations are. We need to take them with us. And I think one of the good areas we can do that is in supporting destinations to better market and understand the impacts that different types of tourists can have in their destination, alongside of course certification and moving towards more sustainable operations in destinations. And I say this for 3 reasons. So it's very likely that destinations will need a balance of different types of tourists to deliver the benefits that they want and need. Where tourists stay, what kind of accommodation they choose, what they buy and what they do can all affect and will benefit or have negative impacts on the destination. For example, hotels are usually generating more jobs and tax revenues than non-serviced accommodation. Yet non-serviced accommodation generally provides more opportunity for micro enterprise development, livelihood diversification for residents. 5-star hotels can unsurprisingly deliver the highest discretionary spend, yet smaller star rating properties play a more significant role in supporting local bars, shops and restaurants. That spreads the revenue further. Some of that information comes from a study we recently did in Tenerife, looking at the mix of tourism that destination has, a very developed destination. Finding that optimal market mix can actually maximise the benefits and minimise the negatives straight away, and actually start to look at bringing down some of these numbers to more manageable. To focus on areas of tourism which have less severe impacts than others. But we should also caution against seeing certain types of tourists as inherently undesirable to a destination. It's possibly the way that tourism is configured in a destination that actually needs to change. Slides here. So I'm just having a problem with my slides here. So, what needs to change? Well, the model and the mindset needs to change, really. We all know that in this room. We've got a lot of people working very hard towards making their businesses, their destinations more sustainable, but we know it fundamentally, as it operates now, tourism is not a sustainable industry, and we need to make systems change sexy. I don't know how we're going to do that. Hopefully there'll be some more ideas from the rest of this event in order to do that. But we also need the right incentives and targets in place in destinations. We need the right checks and balances. The main one, and which we're going to come on to talk about here, is making sure that residents' needs are considered first and foremost and not through lip service. We need better collaboration. We need private and public sectors to work together and both be given responsibility for making change happen. we think that collaboration should be horizontal across ministries and departments, across disciplines, and vertical, so involving provinces, universities, local communities. I'm not saying anything I think here that we haven't said in some of the sessions already. I think we need to be more collaborative as a sector. We tell everyone else that they need to collaborate. We need to do more together. And why should we do that? Because we need the insight, the data, the skills that this brings. No one of us can do this alone. The Travel Foundation is a small NGO based in Bristol in the UK. We're all small organisations generally trying to fight this fight, so we need to fight this together. Funding is the perennial issue. Tourism ultimately needs to cover its costs. We shouldn't be having to try and find funding to do the things that need to be done. Tourism should be generating the funding to do that and properly cover its costs, properly protect its assets. So it's important to take stock of what revenue is being collected, how that's being dispersed, what new funding, what innovations do we need, how can we address these big challenges we're all facing. We need innovation, of course. There's solutions that we haven't even dreamed of. I'm inspired every day in this sector, hearing new ideas coming in. I've spoken to many people at this conference who are doing some fantastic work. We need to encourage that. We need to look beyond our sector. We need more capacity. People have been trained in hospitality, in tourism marketing. We need to bring scientists into tourism. We need to bring new skills. We need the innovation of the private sector to help us to adapt, to evolve. We need new skills in community development, in planning, to develop a new understanding of sustainable tourism and what that looks like. And of course we can't do any of that without the information, not just data for data's sake. We all say we want more of it, but actually data that will help us to understand the costs and benefits, understand the priorities, and understand how to make strategic business decisions. So I'm going to finish now. I really hope to encourage you to download and read the report. We'd love feedback on it. We'd love ideas around how we can take some of these things forward. I'm going to open to the panel now, and I'll introduce the panellists in more detail. So they've been on a journey themselves with working with destinations and helping them to look at new ways to understand the impacts of tourism, but also how it can be developed and managed in a more sustainable way. So I'll hand over. I can sit down here. So I am joined. I'm going to try and get your pronunciation names right. Okay. So I'm joined by. I hope I get the pronunciation right. It's Griet, Geudens. She's from Visit Flanders. She's asked me to point out that Flanders is actually the northern part of Belgium, because many people don't know that. So Griet works as a tourism consultant, and her work there mainly focuses on sustainability and quality in tourism. There's been a lot of work going on in Flanders, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. Specifically, the root of her interest in tourism is how tourism affects local communities. And I'm also joined by Dr. Mihee Kang. So she is the Asia Pacific with GSTC, and has done a huge amount of work in so I'm sure most of you already know her, so she needs no introduction. But in particular, we're going to be talking about some experience that you have in the Asia context in relation to some of this. So I've got a couple of questions first, but I really would encourage you to use the Slido and ask your own questions too. And so I'd like to kick off with you, Griet, if I may. Firstly, I know we've talked a little bit about the report, and I know you've had a chance to read it. What were your sort of key takeaways from it, and what sort of resonated with your work in this area? There's a little button on the side there.
Okay, well, I'm very glad that the report is there, because we can use it very well, and we will inform all partners that it exists. And it comes at the right time, I think, because we all know that the cost of travel is much more than it is. And we know that for a very long time, but we are living in a bubble. Thus we don't want to know the real cost, I think. So it's very good that there is now a clear list of what the real cost can be. Next to this, I think it's also very important that it's very complicated, and also at Visit Flanders, it's now adapted or integrated in a policy paper that we will try to know the real cost and to measure all the impact, the real impact of tourism. And as you said already, it's very hard to find people who, yes, scientists. We need. One of our colleagues could not do this because we don't have the knowledge to do it. So we have a cooperation with the University of Leuven. There is someone who is now occupied to do this for us. So it's a good thing, and I think by doing this and by using these facts and figures, we can discuss more the problems, because otherwise we keep on saying there is a problem, but if we cannot make it hard, then it's still, the problem is still, yes, there is like climate change, there is a problem, but now we need data to discuss with other departments, because tourism is not the only sector who can do something about it. We are depending of other sectors, so it's quite good that we have to deal with this and in cooperation with other sectors.
Yeah, okay, and what about you, Mihee? What's your take on it?
Thank you. My experience with the Asian Pacific region, I could find all the invisible burden came from lack of management. During another session, so we talked about all these issues, but I'd like to emphasize again lack of management. But lack of management came from not only one the reason. There are multiple different reasons. The first, as Griet mentioned, tourism needs another the agency or ministry's collaboration. So tourism itself have a really limited area to impact on. So they needed to work with environment, forestry, agriculture, or marine and land transport. But the government may not understand or may not appreciate the complexity of management of tourism. They just think if there's any attraction, tourists just come there. So they just count the money. And then tourism, the ministry or agency, even though they look for sustainability with quality of tourism, to have a budget from the Ministry of Finance, they needed to show some quality and quantity, but finance ministry usually look for the big number. So if the whole government work together, if not, it's harder to achieve sustainability, and then we will see the invisible burden everywhere. And another issue is that the government in charge of managing tourism destination, they usually have reactive approach to manage that destination rather than proactive approach. So it means they are busy responding to already caused issue, and then busy solving problems. Before the problems, they need to plan or expect what kind of issues they may have in the future. But when I talk to many different countries and the local government, they say, oh, Mihee, we have no over-tourism problem. We need more tourists, so we don't need to calculate carrying capacity now. So just we need to promote our destination. So then I say, I could see certain destinations, suddenly they have a big number of tourists coming to that destination, and then they have unexpected over-tourism issues. Yeah.
So just building on that, could I ask you, we talked earlier, a very interesting example of that that you mentioned in Korea, where suddenly virtually overnight, without any intervention from the DMO, a new attraction had sprung up, a new must-go destination was suddenly on the map, and the residents weren't particularly happy with this?
Yeah, here are my Korean colleagues. They all know this city. The name of Yeosu is in a really far south city. But traditionally, the city is not tourism destination. But a few years ago, one Korean singer, he sang about the beautiful beach of that city. And then it was, hit all over Korea. And then everybody wanted to, stroll along the beach. So then the city government found, it could be very attractive destination, and then they, built some the infrastructures, including cable car. But then there are a huge number of domestic tourists, not international. They visited there. So now local people, they are suffering from the 4 times raised, the housing price and the traffic, and they're full of trash. So, but again, they are not, depending on tourism industry. They have all the different, jobs. So only maybe 5% of residents, they work in tourism sector. So the local, the NGOs, they require the city government to survey the citizens, how they responded to tourism, but they refused. So other civil society surveyed residents, and then the result is really shocking. About 80% of citizens are not happy with the tourism. They don't want tourism development. And then 95% of the core area for tourists don't want tourism development. But of course, the city government, they don't announce the results, and then they want to hide that. And then still they promote their area without any other strategy to solve that problem. So again, the city didn't expect that destination could be really popular destination, but one pop song just hit the market. So in that case, we can ask, we can't complain them or criticize them, you didn't prepare, because it happened without expectation. But when the problem caused, they immediately needed to take some action. But they take action to please tourists. So that's also lack of management. I have other things, but I will, yes.
Thanks, yeah. And Griet, so just building on that point, a lot of the work you've been doing in Flanders is actually around understanding what it is that the local people want from tourism, and actually trying to put them quite central in the planning of tourism. And I think it's a really important example that the destination you mentioned was experiencing all of the burdens of tourism. Maybe some were experiencing the benefits, but actually the large majority they didn't want this. They were seeing pretty quickly that the positives weren't outweighing the negatives. Could you tell us about the work you've been doing? You've got a couple of slides, I think, as well.
I'm show a few slides for this.
If you want this.
Because indeed, in 2016, we started a survey. For the residents. Yeah, and we started it in Bruges. Bruges or Brugge, it's our main attraction. In Flanders. This is a picture of Bruges, just to give you an idea. This also. What's very typical in Bruges is that it's a very, very small town. It's only 19,500 inhabitants, and we have 9.5 million visitors. So it's enormous, and it's still growing and growing. So we have 2.5 million overnight stays, day recreation 25 million. 30 December, it's the most dense day of the year. Then we have almost 6,000 visitors in one day. Yeah, the tour boats, because we have a lot of kennels, 1.25 million. But there is still a crowd, you see a lot. And also very important is 50% stay less than 3 hours. So only to have these figures and these data, there was a lot of discussion in Bruges, but also in the rest of our art cities, what we call our other tourist attractions. And because of these figures, and because of in the media we hear nothing else than over tourism, than other competitive destinations like Bruges, Barcelona, Amsterdam, Dubrovnik, maybe the most competitive, which problems that occur there. Then we decided in 2016 we do a residence survey. Because we want to know, yeah, we have the figures, and first of all, we inform the residents about these figures, because then they were a lot of surprise. They see that there are a lot of tourists, but if you really know the figures, then that's something else. But then we asked a lot of questions. It was really a face-to-face survey. And first of all, what came out, well, 76% of the residents support tourism, or still support tourism, I must say, better. And 70% says the benefits outweigh the negative impact. This is also because of most of the residents are involved in tourism. They benefit directly from tourists. So we started in 2016 to do this survey. In 2017 we did it also for the other 4 art cities. And then we see it's quite different, because every city is different. A very big city can have much more number of tourists, but the impact and also the feeling, but because it's also about the feeling. Some of them say it's too crowded. We don't have enough place for ourselves anymore. In a bigger city, it's not the case. Here, other results, like 55% say in some districts I feel limited in my comfort. 33% say the increasing number of tourists reduces the viability of the city. 26% says I feel that our city is not longer us. And 11% the pressure of tourism has a negative impact of our life. What's important for this? Well, the first time you do it, when you just have the figures, but the most important thing is that we monitor it now. So this year we just finished our second survey for the residents, and in January we will have new results. And then it's up to the local authority, what are they doing with these results? Because then it's the question, what is too many? What is too much? At what percentage can you say that the pressure of tourism has a negative impact on my daily life? Do they wait till it is 20%? Do they wait till it is 25%? It's up to them. And then we see already quite the attitude of the mayors, but also of the local tourism directors. It's quite different on different results in their cities. So, but these figures and these data also it's also about the impact of tourism that we never before we measured it. But now, with all these problems, we know this is quite important. And then also for what's in the report, the most important thing, once you have the figures, is what are you going to do with it? What kind of actions you will take? And then there are a lot of good examples, like city tax. But are you? Yeah, it's not transparent. nobody, as you said, that it's not for a visitor, but also not for a resident, and also even not for the city. What are they doing with the city tax? But also the demand question. You can, visitor management. There are a lot of instruments a local authority can use to, regardless over tourism. And pricing, we had in the debate before, pricing is maybe one of the solutions, but that's up to the local authority. What we as Visit Flanders we can provide the survey, we finance the survey, we can provide so the data, and we can give them a lot of information about instruments that exist and also about good examples. Because I liked also very much the examples in the report, like in Sydney, that they did a survey on the residents and they asked what is the value for the residents of the opera house. Well, if the residents put a high value on something, then maybe you can put more money on it. If it's not, if there is no value for the residents, well, then maybe the tourism sector doesn't have to make a lot of efforts in this one. So this is something, our answer, maybe I can say to over tourism, and Bruges already take a few actions, like they have a hotel stop, they have a stop on holiday homes, they concentrate all the tourists in the center. Like most of the time we hear, and also our two other art cities in Flanders choose the opposite way. They choose to enlarge the region where tourists are coming. But Bruges did the opposite. They say no, the center, real center, the golden circle they call it, that's for tourists, and the rest is for the residents. So it's a choice, but they can only make it to local authorities, and we as a tourism board we can only advise them and say what kind of opportunities, what kind of possibilities there are.
So thank you very much for that. There's a question come through on Slido which I think was quite a good one, and relates, I guess, to the I don't know, do you know how I put these up on the screen? Oh, there. Yeah, thank you. So, when calculating the hidden cost, how many euros is dissatisfaction of local residents worth?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks to Anonymous for that one.
What I like, sometimes you have it in an attraction or for a benefit evening, so you can give as much as you want. And most of the time, people will give more than if you put a price on it. So it's a good way to know what's really the price. If they don't want to pay, then it's not worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a real point of the report, is that once we understand what the costs are, and we can look at we clearly understand the benefits. We know how many visitors came and how much they spent and how long they stayed. But once we actually start to say, well, how much did that cost us, we can actually see if this is a positive or a negative sum. And residents really aren't going to be happy if you said, we're going to bring in more tourists and we're going to lose money as a city. This is going to cost you more. You're going to have to pay more for infrastructure. You're going to have to put up with overcrowding. You're going to have to put up with these things. Of course, there are going to be costs. We can't eliminate them completely, but what we can do is try and balance those costs against the positives, increase the positives, reduce the negatives, and make it, in favour of the destination. Is there anything you'd like to sort of add from your experience around this? I think you had another point you wanted to make.
Related to cost, the government or destination level, they always show, how much profit they gained from tourism, but they don't really put how much money they invested. So that's why always tourism look like brought benefits more than costs. So this day in Korea, we assess ecotourism destinations, and then we require many evidences. Here are one Korean ecotourism destinations, the local association. So when we started that assessing their performance, destination was not happy, and then they didn't provide enough information. But still, what they feel difficult to submit is investment data. They don't want to share investment. They want to share what they gained. So not only the money-wise and tourist satisfaction. Usually tourists, show the really high satisfaction because they are holiday, and then destination really try to please them. So tourist satisfaction is quite high. But again, there is no data on how residents feel about tourism. So that's also cost aspect. So in other Asian regions, I couldn't find any data they surveyed local residents' satisfaction.
Thank you. That's great. I'd like to go back to you again, actually, on this next question. So this is a question about assets, destination assets beyond what we typically class as tourism assets in terms of hotels and airports and so on. So the question is, how do GSTC standards address the invisible burden when they have no criteria for open spaces, attractions, heritage sites, as they're not classed as the destination? Would you like to answer that from a GSTC perspective?
It depends on how we define destination. So, and GSTC really have comprehensive criteria to measure invisible burden and costs. So we have all individual criterion of solid waste, including food waste, energy, water, and also social impact, not only economic impact. So, and then we talk about the heritage sites, not only the physical heritage, also intangible heritage we deal about. So if destination really follow GSTC criteria for destination, and then they measure, they can calculate the cost, and then they can improve themselves. But can I share some the positive changes these days? Yes, still, not many destinations, they measure their cost according to even GSTC criteria, but we can see some changes in recent years, especially the national government, like Vanuatu. We have a Vanuatu here, and Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, including Japan. This morning we announced that they will follow GSTC criteria for destination. They set their GSTC criteria as the national standard. Then they are going to encourage their destination or industry to follow GSTC criteria. And then, of course, attract them to do so, they give some different, incentives. But also, we also work closely with the government, and then not just encourage. Encouragement is not enough. So the leg of management is related to enforcement of their regulation. But just this criteria, always check if there's regulation, and then is it enforced? So they are going to, follow that guidelines. So I can say GSTC covers invisible burden, and then we can see positive changes at least in the Asia Pacific region.
Great. I was going to just ask you, and I touched on it briefly in your presentation, but what do you hope will happen with this information you've now gathered? You're about to publish your new report. What's the sort of one real change that you hope, going back to our sort of original discussion around infrastructure and costs, how do you hope the data that you've collected will be used to, what sort of decisions do you hope will be made by the planners, by those in charge using that?
Well, I hope that with this data that some people will have the courage to take radical actions, because I think this is necessary, and not putting the data besides, but, and I'm with radical action I mean not just minimize something, or but really if they can say this is enough. So I hope yet, and I think we need just a few people who wants to do this. I think a very good, one leader. We need a few leaders in this, a few people who give the example. And I think if some local authority become transparent about the hidden cost, and a few consumers will say, well, if this is the hidden cost, well, we have to pay more, that there will become a discussion. And that it will change, that there will be a more ethical also involvement, a movement that will come to fair trade. It's more a fair trade principle. Yes, and I think the local authorities, but also consumers, that I think if they are aware of the cost, that some of them, and I think certainly the next generation will, yes, I think they will do the effort of, they will paying, I think. Maybe not all of the cost, but they will pay a fair fair price. Yeah.
Do you think that having sight of some of those costs, if you were to be able to present a balance sheet to some of the people involved in the surveys that you did and said, look, here it is in black and white, tourism's costing you this, it's bringing in this much, but it's costing you this much, whether those answers might have been different? Do you think that would have influenced the responses from the residents?
Well, it will be a big discussion, but that's good. I think we need more discussions as well in tourism. We've seen that in the last years with constructing our new vision. We've seen that, and if you bring people together also from different kinds of sectors, because we were always sitting and thinking from our tourism perspective, and I think that's not good. I think it's not done anymore, because we live in a complex world. Everything is changing, and we need all the others to make a change. And a discussion with good data, I think it's the basis to start a discussion.
Thank you. I'm just going to quickly pass over to Ian.
Sorry, I get frustrated with Slido. I've got a question about the cost, the hidden cost. That seems clear. So about then going some way to meet the cost through taxes, and I'm not convinced that transparency about how the money is used is needed to convince visitors about tourism taxes. Because people pay taxes all the time. They don't know where their income tax goes and all the rest of it. Transparency generally in taxation might be a good thing, but the barrier isn't tourists throwing up their hands and saying, I'm not paying that €2 on this room, I'm going to another city tonight. You know, it doesn't happen. The barrier comes from the industry and the tour operators and others saying, well, we're not going to bring our visitors to the city, and then lobbying governments and so on. Doesn't really come from local authorities. In the UK at the moment, there are local authorities queuing up, wanting to impose visitor taxes, with Edinburgh leading the way, but lots of others, the London Mayor, lots of them want to do it. The industry is fiercely against it, and the government at the moment listens to the industry. That's where the barrier is, and that's where the transparency needs to be, because the industry argument is, we don't believe you'll use this for the infrastructure and so on. It's a disingenuous argument, but that's where the transparency needs to be.
Thanks. I was going to say there's a question in there somewhere, but thanks for your contribution in. It's always welcome. Yeah, I mean, if I can speak from the Charles Foundation's perspective, I think that, you know, once we understand what these costs are and who's incurring them, you know, clearly, you know, if you're running a hotel in a destination, your responsibility, and the reason people are visiting that destination generally, although we're staying in a lovely hotel for this conference, it's where it is the reason that people come. You know, the natural environment, the trails, the things you can do here. And so, as a beneficiary of that visitation, I probably need to understand what the impact of my guests is on some of those assets. And at the moment, that's not clear. And I think once you can get that data, once you can present that case and say, you know, we've all got a responsibility, because if you want to be operating your hotel in 10 years' time, you're going to want to make sure we're investing and looking after these natural, cultural assets that mean people will actually get on a plane and fly out to the middle Atlantic and visit this place and stay in your hotel. So, so there's that kind of transparency, really, and having a more integrated conversation and created shared agenda around some of these assets. So that's a take. Would you like to add anything to that? There was actually a related question there. So I think around how tourism businesses have they been involved in this work in Bruges? So the actual question, I'm craning my neck a little bit, is have tourism businesses been involved in a research and policy response in Bruges?
Well, yes, in a sense that all the residents were involved, because it was a survey on the residents, and all the businesses located in Bruges were involved. In this way, as a resident. Next to the resident survey, what we see now is that a lot of cities bring together, invite all the businesses, all the residents, all who is interested in tourism, that they invite them to for an evening to inform them about tourism, about their tourism policy, and then it's really a workshop that they can participate what they want, how tourism will be developed in the future. That's also something that we see happening, in a lot of cities already. I think we as Visit Flanders, we gave the example by, we had a lot of think tanks and so on, where we invited a lot of people, not only the usual suspects of the tourism partners, but really everyone who wants to be involved and who wants to be informed about tourism, who is concerned about tourism. And we had a lot of think tanks, we had a lot of 2 days workshops on how tourism must be in the future and so on. And now we see that the cities are copy this by doing this for their local.
So it's infectious.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. So I mean, I guess we need to just move things forward by doing stuff, and others will follow, and realise probably what we're doing is imperfect, but it's better than doing nothing. Great. Do you know how much time we have left now? Because I know we started a little bit late, but okay, we've got about 10 minutes. So let's just cover these off, and then we'll go and grab some coffee, recharge our batteries for the final session. So this question is around, I don't know if either of you have a perspective on how tourism impact can be measured and monitored efficiently. I'm sure we can have a certification answer to that. But you know, who's able to do this and pay for it? Would you?
So far, I didn't really see great and efficiently the major tourism impact, but partially like economic impact is measured or social impact is measured. But I think now actually in Korea, I'm working on how we monitor different types of tourism impact separately. So we are developing some scheme. But I think who is able to do, so I think a management body, usually the government have to invest to develop the scheme to measure the not only environmental impacts or social economic impacts, and also all the details. And then they have to pay for. But there are a lot of also CBT destinations, and then what we are doing is train them to monitor themselves. So also environmental changes, because they are living in the destination, so easier for them to track the environmental changes. Also, the local, usually tourism associations, they working on to measure the residents' response to tourism impact. So, but they need some, like for example, survey form. So we are making the standardized, questionnaires for surveying visitors and also residents, and then the scheme for environmental changes.
Just a thought to throw in there. Something we were sort of been calling for recently is around more thoughtfully marketing destinations, and actually. There's never any money for any of this. We're all saying, who's going to do this and where are we going to pay for it, and where are we going to get this data from? There's a lot of money in tourism. Perhaps some of it could be allocated towards some of these things. We're all very good at marketing destinations and spending lots of money on trade shows and TV ads and promotion. Just a fragment of that, just 1%. Of a destination's total marketing budget actually spent on monitoring the impacts of tourism would keep us all in work in this room for, the rest of our lives and the next generation. I think, we've got to, the destinations probably have got to start thinking about these costs, recognizing that the risk of inaction and not investing in that is a recipe for disaster. And just thinking about the finances you have in place, but you could be using a tiny fraction of to actually start tracking, managing, monitoring, as they're already spending a lot of money on visitor satisfaction surveys and now on finding out how residents feel, and actually let's start putting some more money into this and getting a clearer picture of what's really going on in your destination.
Because I'm working in Asia Pacific region, there are all the different level of countries development, and in some countries, even though the destination management body have really big willingness to do so, they have lack of human resources and the lack of finance. So usually they depend on foreign aid, but foreign aid projects, the money is usually project-based. That's 2, 3, maximum 5 years, and then they don't invest, the system development. So when the project finished, there's no one who, the follow-up, and then also they have to look for another foreign aid, but that's a different project. So there is no continuity of the same theme. So I feel so sorry about that. So I think if you hear someone who work in ODA program, so we need to change how to support the other countries to have a better management system.
We had a question from Jose, which I think is probably a related point, saying how can we integrate existing tools like tourism satellite accounting and increasingly tourism observatories being set up in destinations to promote evidence-based sustainable tourism policies. And again, I think when you look at taxation, a lot of these things are actually just going straight into promotional budgets. So we're going to take more from the visitors and we're going to put it straight into getting more visitors so we can generate more income and create more jobs and so on. But without actually using some of that to say, well, what's this going to mean, and how are we going to make sure that we don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg? That they need to be thinking very smart about how they invest those additional funds that they might come into, and not just on the typical things that DMO spend money on. So this is a question that's just come through asking around examples of developing country governments, DMOs, actively measuring tourism impact. I think from our perspective there are destinations starting to measure impacts, but perhaps none that I'm aware of that really have a full picture. Maybe looking at things like, you know, you've been looking at in terms of how satisfied residents are, or what infrastructure requirements might be needed. But usually in terms of big capital expenditure projects like new ports, new airports, etc. Would either of you have any examples you'd like to share, or do you have any destinations that you kind of look at as really good examples of places that are measuring this, or is no one doing it?
You know, but in developing countries, as I assessed or discussed with, they usually focus on solid wastes and food waste. So they measure, actually not measure, they try to clean up their destination. Then automatically they measure how much solid waste that they produce. But still, sometimes it's hard to have exact data, because there are a lot of illegal disposal of the solid waste. If you go to some island, there's another island of garbage, so they hide. So the government know that, but they have no capacity to deal with. So they just let the garbage have another island inside of an island. So there's some movement to measure tourism impact, mainly in environmental impact, but still I can't say they really actively and systematically, efficiently measure tourism impact. It can be the next the task to do.
So I think we're probably all ready for a little caffeine fill now, before we head into the final session this afternoon. Before we go, I just wanted to just ask you, I'm not going to drop this question on you because I did sort of share this one in advance, but I just wanted to get your final takeaway really on if you could change one thing about the way destinations are managed in relation to some of the things we've been talking about, what would it be?
I think because we hear a lot of negative things these days, I think we need another positive story. To look at how can tourism contribute to make a destination a good place to visit and to live in, and I think we have to work on this one. This is a new concept we developed within Visit Flanders, and I hope now it's also part of the policy paper of our new ministry. So I hope we can continue to work on this, because it makes I think, and we see it for all our tourism partners, they all need another and a positive story, and they all want to contribute. We get a lot of questions on how can they do it, how can we facilitate them. We are planning more networking, more working together with especially different partners, just to make, I wouldn't say to make a better world, but we are convinced now that we have a positive story to travel, and just to do certain things that it can contribute in a positive way.
So sort of more positivity and more action, and that positivity is potentially infectious and leads to more engagement and more change.
Yes.
And how about you? Final thought from you, Mihee, if I may.
Globally, if I can change, then I will imposing a really high tax on aviation fuel, and then really strictly manage all the plastic uses on flights and other events. But when I went to just the individual destination, I really convey the idea to the resident to say they have a right to refuse tourism development, because they usually really accepting, and especially in Asian culture, they really try to please their guests. But I share negative impact of tourism, and then before going further, I emphasize you have a right to refuse, and that if you feel not good about the tourism, please raise your voice before government attack more tourism development.
Thank you both very much. And it was, being able to give people the voice, be able to have more informed choices about actually what this means, and really presenting some of the, some of the balance sheet, and saying, you can have a lot of positives from this, but there will also be some negatives too. So, well, thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you all for staying here. I'm sure you're desperate for coffee, so let you go.